I make no apologies for being an urbanist. Those are the words of urbanist Chris Bishop as he pushes ahead with planning reforms which he says will promote development across the country. But there's still debate over the extent of his density ambitions. The New Zealand Herald revealing this week that Cabinet knocked back a plan which could have forced Auckland Council to immediately zone for hundreds of thousands more houses. Chris Bishop is with us this morning. Kia ora, good morning.
Good morning.
We appreciate you are bound by Cabinet collective responsibility, but this isn't the first time that your colleagues have knocked back your growth and density plans. Why don't your colleagues share your appetite for density?
Yeah, so that story is a little bit frustrating in the sense that what I took to Cabinet was essentially an enhanced version of what National campaigned on. So National campaigned on forcing councils to zone for 30 years of housing growth, and that is the position, and that is what Cabinet has endorsed. I put an option there which would have seen councils zone for 30 years of growth, or whatever the current capacity is going to be through this very complicated set of changes that councils are in the process of making right now. And where we've landed on is just what we campaigned on, which is 30 years of growth. But the other thing that Cabinet did agree to, which again National campaigned on, which will make a real difference, is big changes around density, around rapid transit stations, around mixed-use zoning in and around those stations, simplifying the definitions of what rapid transit is, abolition of minimum apartment sizes, balcony requirements, a whole lot of really pro-housing moves that will make our cities better. And so I'm comfortable with where we've landed.
As well as those density policy adjustments, you have announced policies to promote development in greenfields. So this week, $100 million to be lent to housing developers for greenfields infrastructure. Greenfields are, of course, the spaces usually on the outskirts of cities. Why does the urbanist housing minister want to make sprawl easier?
What I'm about is making it easier for cities to go up but also go out. And there's a lot of economic evidence that shows that you need to do both. It's not one or the other. You need to do both, or at least allow both to happen and let the economics of where the development happens guide it rather than planning rules. So
I suppose you're not guiding it if you're giving $100 million.
Yeah, so what we're
hand on the scale.
That's an interim step that we're taking in the next 2 or 3 years to aggressively promote housing growth. Where we're heading towards is by around 2027, early 2028, we will have a whole lot of things coming together that will create a much more enabling planning environment for housing. Number one, we've got our Going for Housing growth policies, which is the 30 years of targets. We've got the intensification policies that we've just been talking about. Number two, we've got the infrastructure tools that I'm working on with Simon Watts, which will mean that councils can better support that growth, both in the inner city and on the fringe. That's the kind of missing part of the reforms that Phil Twyford couldn't quite nail, and is really important, very complicated, but extremely important. Essentially allowing growth to pay for growth. And then the third thing that's coming around then is RMA reform as well, which will massively simplify the system, make it easy to build houses. So while we wait for those three things to kind of come on stream, we don't want to let the momentum drop, and so we're doing that.
27, 28. So, I mean, that wasn't part of the election campaign, that it would take you more than a single parliamentary term to actually get these reforms in place.
Well, 2027 is when the councils all do their long-term plans, right? So the next 10-year long-term plan period is 2027. So what we're going to be doing over these 3 years actually is an extremely ambitious and comprehensive program of reform. If we can get RMA reform, local government funding and financing changes, and fundamental reforms to our planning rules in relation to housing and targets, and we can get all that done in 3 years, frankly, I'll be very proud of myself and the government, and it will make for a much better housing market from 2026, 27 onwards.
We're going to talk RMA reform in a couple of minutes, which I know will have everyone very excited indeed. Greenfields, back to the greenfields.
Planning law on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, exactly. Get excited, New Zealand. I mean, greenfields are fascinating, right? Because they come with development in greenfields come with lots of externalised costs. So a report from the Infrastructure Commission last month considered Drury, which is a vast greenfields development about 40 k's south of Auckland CBD. Over the next 4 decades, Drury's going to grow to have about 55,000 people. But the transport infrastructure being funded by local and central government to connect Drury is $4.4 billion. So that works out at about $80,000 per resident in Drury. Is that good value for taxpayers?
It is a lot of money, and the last government kicked off the Drury development.
But
look,
in principle,
sprawl,
is that? Would you say it's good value?
well, sprawl makes sense in some circumstances. I mean, think about Drury, right? The reason why the last government kicked off the Drury development, and they're building new train stations at Parata and Drury, and they funded, and I just opened, and they funded it, the electrification of the line from Papakura to Pukekohe, for example. If you think about that corridor between essentially Hamilton and Auckland, that is a massive growth node for the country, right? Essentially what's happening is Hamilton and Auckland are moving closer and closer together. Within 25 years, they may well be essentially the same city. That does come with enormous economic advantages for Auckland, but also Hamilton and the broader Waikato. So you've got good land for housing there, you've got good industrial and commercial land. So, yep, it is expensive, but the cities and regions have got to grow, and I think it does make sense to better connect Auckland and Hamilton with better rail, better state highway connections, for example, and public transport's a part of that as well.
Yeah, I guess the question is, given you are now not only the housing minister, not only the infrastructure minister, the RMA minister, you're also the transport minister, if in principle incentivising greenfields development, if it comes with these huge externalised costs through the perspective of the Transport Minister, if Housing Minister Chris Bishop is at risk of being at odds with Transport Minister Chris Bishop?
I don't think there's a disconnect. I mean, when it comes to that greenfields growth, one of the really important things, as we're saying, for the local infrastructure, that has to be paid for itself by the beneficiaries of that new infrastructure. This is the growth paying for growth principle. So what happens at the moment is with some of the greenfields developments is it's essentially cross-subsidised by existing ratepayers. So people in a far-flung part of Auckland are paying for greenfields developments in a 2 hours away sometimes. That doesn't make sense. That's what our planning reforms will stop. It will mean that the beneficiaries of new development pay for that new development, the local roads and the wastewater required. We're moving to a much more flexible system to allow the growth costs to be recovered. That's the development levy work that we're doing, which is really important. And as I say, is the work that we've picked up.
So in the future, to use that Drury example again, would the residents of Drury end up paying for that $4.4 billion to connect them?
Well, they won't end up paying for all of the $4.4 billion because some of that is trunk infrastructure that is in the national interest and the region's interest to build. Things like state highway projects, for example.
This is the thing. There's always an externalised cost, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely there is to some extent, but you've got to separate out the local infrastructure, your local roads, your local wastewater, stormwater treatment plants, from things like state highways. And there's a national benefit to having a state highway network that can move goods efficiently as well. So it's about who pays for what, and there's clearly a role for local residents to pay, and we're making sure that happens. There's clearly a role for local ratepayers to pay to some extent. There's also a role for central government because it's in the national interest that we have an efficient state highway network.
Yeah. So much of your urban vision is about payoffs. So the cost of not having a quarter acre is offset by being much closer to the city and much closer to your workplace. But to make that a worthwhile payoff, of course, you've got to get people out of cars. A big part of that is public transport. The other part of that is cycle lanes. With your urbanist vision, how would you compare your philosophy to cycling and walking infrastructure with the previous Transport Minister?
Well, I see myself as essentially a continuation of where Simeon was taking transport, and I think the government policy statement on transport was a very good document. It spells out a very ambitious program of both reform but also funding and investment over the next 3 to 10 years as well. We've got these big roads of national significance around the country.
But when it comes to cycle lanes, do you disagree with him at all with his philosophy on that? Because he was pretty outspoken. He wasn't a supporter of cycle lanes, not in principle necessarily, but he thought that much too much money had been spent on cycleways.
Well, I think cycle lanes make sense in urban areas, for example. I mean, the last national, I get a bit frustrated by the debate because cycle lanes make sense in some areas and they don't make sense in other areas. And when they're badly designed, it puts at risk the social case for cycling. Some of the stuff that's happening in Wellington, for example, has driven people demented because they're in the wrong place and they've massively congested take Molesworth Street right by Parliament, for example.
Yeah,
the cycleway there has actually stopped the buses from moving. So buses are now slower. So when buses are slower, people get.
So is there any difference between the Chris Bishop cycleway philosophy and the Simeon Brown cycleway philosophy?
I think we're both on the same page, which is they make sense in some areas, they don't in others. But look, the last national government, Simon Bridges was the Transport Minister. We opened a whole range of different cycleways around the place, some of which are very popular and make a lot of sense, for example. And I'm exactly the same. The cycleway from Lower Hutt to Wellington, in my own electorate, so slightly biased, That's a seawall that's protecting the railway line, very important, because if the railway line went down, Lower Hutt and Wellington would both be stuffed.
Yeah.
It would massively congest Highway 2. So you've got to build a seawall. If you're building a seawall, put a cycle lane on top. That makes total sense.
You have capped Kāinga Ora's building program at maintenance levels, but you're funding community housing providers, aka CHIPS, and providing them with Crown lending facilities. Why do you favour new development through CHIPS rather than Kāinga Ora?
So where we're moving to, so we're favouring them at the moment, and the reason we did that in Budget 2024 was to basically, because we're in the middle of doing the Kāinga Ora turnaround plan, and Kāinga Ora became this bloated, inefficient monstrosity under the previous government. So we said, while we're doing the turnaround plan and you guys are getting your house in order, you're not going to have any more money. It would have been a pretty weird thing to say to them, here's some more free cash while we're reforming you.
So to be clear then, are you open to rescaling up Kāinga Ora's building program?
In the future, once we're confident that they have got their house in order, they've got their build costs down, they've got their efficiencies in line, they've got their back office operations in line, and that they've got a very clear plan as to what to do.
And realistically, what would be the time frame for that?
Well, we'll look at that
at the moment.
Well,
give a rough.
The turnaround plan's going pretty well, so we'll look at that in the next couple of years as we move through. Where we want to get to the system to is the government as a active purchaser in the middle of the social housing market and making active decisions about where they build and what gets built, but completely agnostic as to who builds it. So for some parts of the country, Kāinga Ora is the major player, and they're going to continue to be the major player, and we will fund them to build. In other parts of the country, community housing providers play a really good role, and they're much closer to their tenants, so we will fund them. Really, where I want the system to be is much more focused on the granular need of people.
Yeah.
Okay. At the moment, it's a very one-size-fits-all approach. Give you an example. 60% of people on the social housing wait list, so the register, people who are in need of social housing, need a one-bedroom unit. Kāinga Ora, their stock, 78,000 houses, 12% of that are one-bedroom units.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so we've got to get much more focused on building what people need. In some parts of the country, you've got a heavy disability population. In some parts of the country, say Kapiti, for example, you've got an older population. The older, I'm very worried about elder housing, for example.
Yeah.
So me being much more segmented about need and what we build. So that's where we're taking the system.
Okay, so at the moment, while you wait for Kāinga Ora to implement the changes that you have demanded, you're focusing on CHIPS or those community housing providers. So in Auckland, what would be the net result this year? How many new state houses will be built in Auckland this year?
Can't remember off the top of my head in terms of Auckland. We've delivered 2,000 in Auckland.
Those are funded under the last government, though.
Yeah, funded under the last government. We'll get to 3,000 by the time of the next election, which was the commitment we gave on the 2023 election.
But when you'll get to 3,000, how many of those are funded by the previous government?
2,000. Some of them will be.
Well, there's not really a commitment, is it? I mean, so you said in the last election campaign that you would continue to increase the state public housing stock in Auckland by building new stock at least the current net build rate of 1,000 houses a year.
Yes, and we'll get to 3,000.
But 2,000 were funded under the last government.
Yeah, well, we inherit.
It's not really the spirit of the pledge, is it?
Funding continue. I mean, we inherited funding settings from the previous government. Budget 2023 funneled money into social housing in Auckland and other parts of the country.
Okay.
We took a range of budget savings in budget 2024, but there's
yeah, but if you're saying you're going to build 3,000 houses in Auckland, budget, and actually you've only funded 1,000 houses, and the previous 2,000 were funded by the last government.
There's an upcoming budget, and there's an upcoming budget in 2026 as well.
Yes.
And as I say, we've got
houses take time to build.
Yeah, that's right. And we've got quite big fundamental changes happening to the social housing system. And it is really important we get that right, because the system isn't working.
Okay.
Right, 20,000 people are on the register.
So in August, your government tightened up the gateway to emergency housing, and your officials warned at the time about the changes causing an increase in homelessness. Here's what they said, quote, "Making these changes ahead of significant increases to the supply of affordable housing and more preventative wraparound supports does create a risk of increased levels of rough sleeping, people living in cars and overcrowding." You pushed ahead with those changes anyway. Has changing the emergency housing policy increased homelessness?
I don't believe so. I think it has made the system clearer for everybody to understand. There will always be a need for emergency housing. I want to make that really clear. And for people who need emergency housing, it will always be there.
So you don't believe so? Based on what?
Based on what I see and hear around the place.
But give us some data. See and hear, that's just anecdotal stuff. Give us some data that backs up your
the register was 25,000 when we came in. It's now 20,000.
I understand the register. I understand the register's gone down. I understand the emergency housing's gone down. What about homeless numbers?
Well, there is basically no agreed definition of what homelessness is. Okay, there's a Stats New Zealand thing which is done as part of the census every 5 years or so.
Can you point to any homeless measure, accepting that there's disagreement about how you define homelessness? Can you point to any homeless measure during your time in government that has gone down?
Yes, I've just given you the social housing register and emergency housing. Well, those
aren't homeless measures.
Those are hard. That's hard data.
Those are people waiting on a register for a social house. That doesn't suggest that the number of people on the streets has gone down.
There is no government measure that measures homelessness.
Okay,
the ones we have are proxies.
There are Auckland City Council. There are Wellington Council. So yes, but those changes. Hang on a second. Those changes came into effect at the end of August, right? So between September and January, Auckland Council's community impact team recorded a 53% increase in the number of people living in cars, parks or the streets. In the 12 months at the end of last year, Wellington data showed rough sleeper numbers increased by a third. Do you accept that your changes could have contributed to higher numbers of homeless people?
No, because I think when people are in those situations, they should talk to MSD and there will be housing support available for them. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars every month on housing support, or tens of millions of dollars every month on hundreds of millions of dollars per year on housing support. There is social housing available. There's emergency. There's transitional housing.
We appreciate that these measures are. So no one's disputing that you've completely torn out all of the social supports that might be available. However, the changes that you introduced, it's pretty clear, have made the gateway to emergency housing much more complicated. So the State of the Nation report from the Salvation Army said that introducing reduction targets and tightening the criteria, the gateway to emergency housing, is likely, quote, a key contributor to the rising street homelessness.
Well, that's their view. We've also made
it's their view, it's the Auckland Council view, it's the Wellington measure as well.
We've also made it easier to get out. There are now hundreds, thousands of children who were living in emergency housing motels who are now living in warm, dry homes as a result of the changes made by the government.
So this is the critical point.
Of children.
So emergency housing before you came in was costing New Zealand more than $300 million a year.
Correct.
Vastly expensive,
$1 million
right?
a day.
Yeah. So Tama Potaka, your associate minister, says that 80% of those moving out of emergency housing were going to better, more permanent solutions, which is great. But it still leaves 20%, right?
Yes.
And so if the policy settings that you have introduced put 80% of people from emergency housing into better options, but leave 20% of people on the streets, is it worth it?
Well, I don't think it's correct to say that those 20% are on the streets.
Except that you can't point to any data that actually suggests they aren't. And I can give you numbers from Auckland Council, from Wellington, concerns from the Salvation Army, which suggest the number of people sleeping on the streets.
We don't have trackers on everyone. We're not running a police state.
Well, Auckland Council's community impact team go and get this data all the time. Before you were in government, they got this data, and between September and January of this year, 227 more people were recorded as sleeping on the streets. Yeah. There's data. You can't give me any.
There's that data, and then there's the...
And then there's what people are telling you. I mean, this is the thing, right? And maybe it's a payoff that's worth making, especially given the expense, $300 million a year. Emergency housing, a lot of people have said, was a terrible policy. You've described it as one of the biggest policy failures in New Zealand history. The question is, if the cost of getting all of those people out of emergency housing and into better options is that some fall through the cracks and end up on the streets, is it worth it?
There is always support available for people who are sleeping on the streets, who are sleeping rough, who are sleeping in cars. The government will always provide support for those people. MSD do that each and every day. Emergency housing, as it was before, which was essentially a free-for-all, was a disaster. We have made it harder to get in, but we have also made it easier to get out, which is why we can point to the signs of success. But am I pretending everything's perfect? Absolutely not. Emergency housing is a symptom of our broken and dysfunctional housing market. That's why we are doing all the things around greenfields, around density, around freeing up land. All of those things will flow on to have an impact. It's very important.
So if you called, just finally then, if you called the previous emergency housing policy a policy failure, do you think this is a policy success?
Yes, we're very proud of it because there are thousands of children who were living in dank, squalid motels who are now living in warm and dry social houses, whether they be transitional or social houses or private rentals.
Yeah. The government has announced its plan to replace the Resource Management Act with 2 new pieces of legislation. The changes come after Chris Bishop scrapped the previous government's RMA reforms. What do you want to achieve?
Fewer plans, fewer consents required, a much simpler planning system, a reduction in cost and red tape, and essentially a liberalised environment in which property rights are at the heart of our planning system rather than an afterthought like they are at the moment.
Your own expert advisory group recommended you carry over the treaty principles clause from the current RMA legislation to the new legislation. Why didn't you?
Well, I appreciate their advice, but we're a government that is in the process of reviewing all of the Treaty of Waitangi principles clauses in legislation throughout our statute book, so it would be a bit strange to put a new one in having gone through a process of reviewing
Well, it's
all
not a
the rest
new
of them.
one, it's just carrying over.
Yeah,
right?
sure, but we're in the process of reviewing them all, and we don't like generic Treaty of Waitangi principles clauses because they're open-textured and amorphous. I want to be really clear, though, it's really important that the treaty is given effect to through the Resource Management Act, and it will. Likewise, the settlements that the Crown has entered into. But we think we can be more deliberate and specific about what those obligations are for both iwi and for mana whenua through the RMA, but also for the Crown. And specificity is important for everybody.
Specificity is vital. And of course, your expert advisory group agreed with that point. They said you could add additional clauses to give, quote, increased certainty about how that clause should be applied.
Yes, well, we're going to do that. We're just not going to have the open-textured thing as well. So I think we're broadly on the same page.
They're saying keep it and be specific, and you're saying scrap it.
Well, we have a coalition commitment to not have principle of Treaty of Waitangi principles clauses.
That's the New Zealand First coalition agreement, eh?
Yes, but generally as a government, I think our side of politics has disliked those clauses for quite some time. It's not about disliking the treaty. It's about saying give effect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi is open-textured and
you're saying be specific,
subject to endless litigation. Be specific. It's in everyone's interest.
So you say that compensation is going to be provided for regulatory takings
in some cases.
Circumstances. So regulatory takings are basically if something external happens, so some new law or plan or whatever is introduced that impacts a property owner's rights.
Yes.
Who will pay that compensation?
It'll be the person doing the taking. So it's a bit like the Public Works Act, right? When the Crown takes you a piece of land for a new road or whatever, you get paid market rates because the compensation comes from the government. So the regulatory takings the compensation will be paid by the person doing the taking. There's a lot of devil in the detail here. We need to work our way through that carefully because not everything is a taking. Land rezoning, for example, is not normally regarded as a taking, and there's some stuff in the expert advisory group report about that. So the devil's in the detail, but as a general principle, if the Crown turns around and says, you've got a piece of land which you could do things to and now you can't, and that has a significant impact on you, then normally you would get compensation. Heritage is a classic example. There's a woman in Wellington who, private house, it's designed by an architect, very famous one. So it's on the Wellington District Plan is heritage protected. There's a whole range of things she can't do with her land that's her private property. She can't do because the City Council or Heritage New Zealand and the Council have decided it's a heritage building. Now, that might be, I like heritage. I think we need to do more to protect our history. But, it's pretty tough on the people whose property it is when the government comes around and decides that.
Well, if it's introduced after the purchase is the critical point, right? So if the property buyer bought a property and then the ground underneath them changed for one of the
this has been in the family for generations, and the City Council's, the heritage.
So you say your RMA reforms are replacing Labor's reforms, which you said didn't go far enough, and you invited Labor to support your version, so they don't rip up your changes like you did to them. Wouldn't a bipartisan approach actually involve including Labor at the earliest possible stages of drafting? Well,
the government's still the government, right? So, we won an election, all three parties on essentially replacing.
I know, but I mean, if it's just a question of bipartisanship.
Yeah, but then you just spend, you spend 2.5, 3 years, spinning wheels and having endless cups of tea, and you might not make any progress. So the country can't wait for that. We do want to get on.
You might also give certainty.
Well, I think I'm optimistic that we can create some level of stability. So I've written to Labor and the Greens, and I've arranged meetings for their relevant spokespeople with Jeanette Campbell and with the officials. After they've had those meetings and got briefed, I will then sit down with them. The devil's in the detail here, and there's quite a bit that I think they agree on. In fact, Rachel Brooking
I'm sure there is.
On Friday. She showed me a list afterwards. The things she likes in the report are longer than the thing she doesn't like.
I read that.
She doesn't like.
I get it's the question's bipartisanship, right? And you came in and scrapped their reforms, and the question is, if we're to have certainty in the future, what's to stop a future potential Labor government from doing the same? So I read that letter.
The whole debate's frustrating because we wrote to David Parker in 2021 and never replied.
Okay.
So, there's a bit of back and forth.
I'm just going to share this line from your letter. Quote, Where we see that compromise could be possible without undermining the intent of our reforms, I'm committed to working collaboratively with you. Isn't that just a way of saying we're happy to be bipartisan so long as you agree?
I saw Chris Hipkins going on about that. No, the intent of that phrase is to say we have a mandate to replace the RMA. We've got coalition commitments that are sacrosanct, that we won't be compromising on. But there's heaps of... Like, the RMA at the moment is 900 pages, right? The devil is in the detail on this stuff.
But it's this notion of bipartisanship, like, we're happy to be bipartisan so long as you agree.
No, I think that's a mischaracterisation of the position. I'm genuinely committed to working with the opposition and the Greens in order to try and create some sort of stability. They may at the end of the day say, we don't agree with this, but on balance, we're going to vote for it, and they might campaign on changing parts of it. That's totally fine. That's politics. You can't denude Parliament of all political clash of ideas, right? Like, political parties do have different views. They're entitled to make those.
But I suppose the question is if bipartisanship and approaching bipartisanship from the very earliest stages would ensure lasting legislation. But I totally appreciate your point.
Did anyone ask Labor these questions when they had an absolute majority?
Well,
no one said to them, hey, what are you doing with National in relation to this and that?
That's for them to answer.
They all got... No one ever asked them those questions.
And look what happened. You ripped up their legislation. So the question is how we can stop it from happening again.
I'm taking a more mature approach. Okay. Right from the start.
I'm sure they would dispute that. Anyway. All right. Listen. No one's getting too excited about this. Listen. So the new proposed electorate boundaries are out.
It's quite a shift from the RMA, but yeah.
Yes. Is it going to make it harder for you to win Hutt South?
I think it's hard to know, to be honest. I haven't actually had a decent look at it yet. I think it's hard to know. Parts of Hutt South have gone into Rimutaka. You know, we've now got a bit of a Hariu, which is, I think people will find a little bit strange because it's essentially part of Wellington City, Newlands and Woodridge. So I haven't had a decent look at it. I think it's probably a bit of a wash.
Initial look, yeah.
I think probably on balance, a bit of a wash. It's always going to be a close seat. Hutt South is always going to be a marginal
keenly
seat.
Contested.
That's right.
Are you getting sick of people asking you if you want to be Prime Minister?
No one really ever asked me that, to be honest. We have a Prime Minister.
Be honest, Chris.
We have a Prime Minister who's doing a great job, and he's doing an excellent job. Just come back from India. That was a success. Investment Summit. Lots of great things going on.
Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.